Exercise 7 deals with the integumentary system. The integumentary system deals with the skin, so we are going to be looking at the different layers of it, the epidermis, the dermis, and depending on which book, the other layers known as the subcutaneous or the hypodermal layer. It is including accessory structures such as your hair, your nails, your sweat glands, your oil glands, and so we're going to be looking at all of these different features and components of it. Overall, what's the function of the integumentary system of your skin? Protection from the outside environment. It helps to insulate. It also helps to cushion, keeps you hydrated. It's involved with temperature regulation. If you get too hot, you start to sweat. It will activate those sweat glands to sweat, and as the water evaporates, it cools the temperature down. Excretion. There's various metabolic activities such as helping to make the precursors for vitamin D. And then a lot of your sensory receptors are also located in the skin. Things such as pressure sensors, temperature sensors. When we look at the structure of the skin, it is divided into two layers. You have the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is the more superficial layer. It is composed of epithelial tissue. The dermis is deep to the epidermis and is comprised of connective tissue. So when we look at this diagram, we can see the epidermis is listed here. It is this uppermost superficial layer, as we just said, and then beneath that is the dermis. Now the dermis is divided into two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. And then underneath the dermis is the hypodermis, sometimes known as subcutaneous. This is not technically part of the integumentary system, but it's one of those things. It's not really part of any system, and so we throw it in with the integumentary system, but we always tell you, oh, it's not part of this, but we're always going to study it here anyway. There are various nerve endings and sensory structures that are in the skin. You have hair follicles, you have sweat glands, you have oil glands. In the subcutaneous layer, you do have the adipose tissue or the fat tissue that helps us insulation. As you can see, there is a nice blood supply to the dermal layer, but not to the epidermis. We'll come back and we'll look at that picture later. So we're going to start at the epidermis. The cells that are often found here, there's four main types. The keratinocytes, which produce keratin. The melanocytes, which produce the melanin. Dendritic cells that are also known as the Langerhans cells. These are a type of phagocytic cell, meaning they will engulf other cells. And then your tactile or your Merkel cells, which are going to be very sensitive to touch. They're a type of receptor. If we look at the layers of the epidermis, we start at the deepest layer. We're going to move superficial. You have 5 layers. In some areas, the palms of your hand and the soles of your feet, where you have a lot more wear and tear and abuse. In all other areas, you will have 4 layers. So what are these layers? Starting at the deepest one is the stratum basal. Then you have the stratum spinosum, then the stratum granulosum. Then you have the stratum lucidum. That is the layer that 5th layer that's only found in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. And then the outermost or most superficial layer is the stratum corneum. In this cross section, you can see an actual slide over here, and then on the right is a schematic drawing of these various layers. So you can see on the stratum basal layer, that deepest layer, this is where the cells are actively going through mitosis. You produce 2 new daughter cells. One stays in the second daughter cell, is going to be pushed upward. The stratum spinosum, here the cells tend to have a lot of filaments in them. It's a precursor to the keratin. And then the stratum granulosum is usually only a couple layers thick. what's happening now is it looks very grainy, as you can see in this layer right here, how it looks grainy, because the organelles are starting to deteriorate. The cell's starting to die. If the epidermis does not have a blood supply, then right down here in this dermal area, you have this little upridge, that has blood supply, which means all of these cells of the epidermis are dependent upon diffusion to get nutrients, gas, and get rid of waste products. And it can only diffuse so far. So when you start reaching the granulosum, the cells are starting to die. And then the stratum corneum, this thickest layer right here, basically the cells are dead at this point. And then they're going to be sloughed off the outer layer. So I hate to disappoint you, but on your skin, most of what you see on the surface of yourself and others, it's dead. It's dead layers. The dermis, which is the underlying layer from the epidermis, is divided into two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. The papillary layer is areolar connective tissue. It's vascular, has free nerve endings in it, it has different sensory receptors that allow for touch, to be able to pick up that touch sensation. It does contain what we call the dermal ridges. That's what produces your fingerprints, so it's genetically determined. The reticular layer is below or deep to the papillary layer. It's comprised of dense, irregular connective tissue. It also is very vascular. It contains sweat and sebaceous glands in some of the deeper pressure receptors, such as your lamellar corpuscles. So in this layer, you can see you have the epidermis, that outermost layer. Then you have the dermal layer. And this is what I was talking about with the ridges that extend up. That's what's going to help cause your fingerprints. So what determines skin color? Well, there can be three main things: melanin, keratin, and the amount of oxygenated blood. Melanin is going to be produced by your melanocytes. It is a darker pigment. Everyone has melanocytes that should be producing melanin. It's just the different skin colorations have to do with how much melanin is actually being produced. Melanin is kind of nature's sunblock. It tends to form on the cells on the side of the nucleus that the sun is penetrating. So on the more superficial side, UV light can cause mutations in DNA, and so what happens is in the cells, the melanin, which I can, are these darker areas right here, that dark pigmentation, and here's your nucleus. It will line up to try to shield, as you can see, it's right here. It's shielding the nucleus, adding protection. Which is kind of an interesting thing, that if you look at different culture groups, the darker skin pigmentation tends to be seen in individuals who naturally come from areas that tend to have more extensive sunlight, like along the equator, where the intensity of the sun and the exposure to the sunlight is much greater. And so there is a need for that protection. It's kind of, like I said, a natural sunblock for protection there. Once again, so this is showing here is your nucleus, but notice how the melanin tends to congregate if the sunlight is coming in this way to protect that nucleus. And then those of us who are fair-skinned, we can't rely on nature's sunblock. We are forced to go buy our own because we don't have that much natural protection from the sun. Keratin is a yellowish type pigment that is often seen, especially with Very fair-skinned individuals, if you consume a lot of, say, yellow vegetables like carrots and squash, etc., you may start to see actually a little bit of a yellowing or oranging coloration, especially like on the face. With young toddlers, young infants, as they're first starting to try solid foods, as you're going through the introducing the different food items, um, that's one time when it especially may be noticeable, where you can tell, that the cheeks and the nose are starting to kind of get this yellowish orange hue, to them, and going, okay, you're on the yellow and orange vegetables now. And then the amount of oxygenated blood. Oxygenated blood does turn red. So once again, that's more seen with fair-skinned individuals if they're really hot. And what does the body do? It increases the blood flow to the surface of the skin so that that heat that's carried in the blood can be dissipated out. But the individual, because you have increased blood flow, it gives a red, so you look flush. What are some of the accessory organs to the integumentary system? You've got the nails, the hair, cutaneous glands. With the nails, there's different terminologies with it. You've got the body, the free edge, the root, etc. So when we look at the nail, excuse me, the free edge of the nail, this area, once again, where it's white, is dead. Why does the nail here look pink? Is because you have this blood supply that's just underneath the nail. And so it does give that coloration to it. The lanula is sometimes referred to as the moon. That's that whitish area right here. Notice that the nail, yes, the root of the nail is below the skin here, growing. And so the cells are actively growing here and pushing the nail out, as you're all aware, in this direction. With the hair, there's 3 different layers: the medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle. The medulla is in the centermost portion, the cortex is in the middle, and the cuticle is on the outer layer. Kind of keep those terms in the back of your mind because you're going to see it again later and later and later multiple times. Whenever you see medulla, that's going to be more in the center, and the cortex is going to be outside of that. You have the hair shaft and the hair root. The hair bulb is at the base of the hair follicle. So this is showing the 3 different layers: the cuticle, the cortex, and the medulla. And then in the hair follicle, you have it, the hair papillae, that's where the nutrients are being provided. The hair matrix is where those cells are actively dividing. And then you have with the hair follicle. So down in this area right here is the hair papillae. So this is where you're providing all the nutrients. So you have a nice good blood supply coming in here. With those nutrients, these cells are actively going through cell division in this area, pushing the cells up. Once again, when the cell division occurs, one daughter cell, stem cell, will stay back, the other daughter cell gets pushed up. You do have the melanocytes that are present here, which help to provide coloration to the hair. Once again, as that hair is being pushed up in this direction, what extends beyond the surface, up here, the hair shaft, that's beyond the surface of the skin, what you actually see, that is actually dead. Sorry about that, but that's the way it is. Notice right here, you've got your epidermis again, your dermal layer, subcutaneous. So here's the hair follicle. The hair shaft is what's above the skin. There is this muscle back here. It's called the erector pili muscle. When it contracts, it's going to pull this hair straight up, and you end up with goosebumps then. Associated with the hair follicle right here, you do have the sebaceous gland that is secreting oils into the hair follicle, and it's going to help lubricate this hair shaft. So that erector pili muscle, it is a smooth muscle, so you do not have control over it. And like I say, that's what causes goosebumps. So you can see when it's relaxed, the hair is laying down. When it contracts, it pulls that hair up. What that does, it's kind of a leftover survival mechanism. It makes you look bigger, and hopefully in a scary situation may scare off a predator. If any of you have cats, you're probably very familiar with seeing this if your cat gets startled, that its hair kind of stands on end, its tail looks real big and puffy. It makes it look bigger. It's, like I say, it's a survival mechanism. With the cutaneous glands, there's two different types. You have your sebaceous, which are the oil glands, and then you have your pseudoaphorous, or the sweat glands. The oil glands, or those sebaceous glands, will usually empty into the hair follicle, and they do secrete the sebum, which is an oil-type substance. It acts as a lubricant. These sweat glands empty through pores onto the surface of the skin. There's two different types of sweat glands. You have your merocrine or eccrine sweat glands. They're all over the body. They produce clear sweat. And then the apocrine sweat glands are in the axillary and the genital areas, and they tend to become much more active as you go through puberty. So this is showing, once again, here is a sebaceous gland or sweat gland that's associated with the hair follicle. And then right here is one of your sweat glands. Notice the pore to the surface of the skin right there. In terms of dermography, which is fingerprinting, your fingerprints are unique. It is determined genetically. And so your fingerprints are unique for you. There's different patterns. There's arches and loops and whorls. And being able to look at a fingerprint and identify it, such as in like forensics or your criminology courses, it is actually a specialized field within that, of learning how to look at a fingerprint, compare and say, you know, is fingerprint A the same as fingerprint B? Like I said, they are unique. It is admissible in a court of law. You can see this is really kind of a neat picture. Once again, it's one of the times when I'm just proving I'm a science nerd. Look how you can see the openings in here of the sweat gland pores. Fingerprints, what that does, the ridges, it actually helps to provide more friction, and it allows you to be able to grasp things better.